Hello there guys and welcome back to The View from the Bridge, a Football.London Chelsea podcast. We have got an extra episode now moving forward. Glad to say I'm Daniel Charles and I'm going to be hosting the extra episode of the View from the Bridge podcast moving forward, along with your regularly scheduled one. So hopefully you enjoy the content over the summer heading into what hopefully is going to be a better season for Chelsea. But unfortunately we do have to do a bit of a post-mortem on this edition. How did TODD BOEHLY break Chelsea? Yes, it is a little bit of a hyperbolic title, but we wanted to kind of spice things up and ask that question along with many others in today's show as we reflect back on what has been an historically bad season for Chelsea, not only in the Premier League. And to join me today is a regular co-host of the View from the Bridge Chelsea podcast, and that is Football.London Chelsea writer Scott Trotter. Scott, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well, Daniel. Relieved that the season's over for a little bit,
Yes.
and ready to move on, I think.
I think many of us are, and hopefully this will be used as a bit of therapy for us all to kind of reflect on where things have gone wrong and hopefully learn some key lessons heading into what is a big summer for Chelsea and for the new head coach Mauricio Pochettino. I want to start at the end. I know in yesterday's podcast we did kind of a clearer look at the Newcastle game and more in depth. So definitely, if people want to go and check that out, please go and do so. It's more looking at the end of the game with the goodbyes from Frank Lampard to Cesar Azpilicueta, who got a lovely banner before the game, and to Ruben Loftus-Cheek, who kind of made the goodbye clear with the way he was waving to the crowd as he was substituted in the second half and also after the game in front of the Harding Lower. It was a somber mood and it wasn't as toxic as I think some of us feared it could be. It seemed like the majority of fans inside Stamford Bridge actually stuck around to applaud the players. Whether they deserved it or not is another question. But just your reflections and also, I guess, looking back to 12 months ago when Chelsea's final game against Watford, TODD BOEHLY was on the pitch that day and we were awaiting the official confirmation of the takeover, how quickly things have changed.
Yeah, I think probably both occasions had a sense of relief about them, probably for very, very different reasons. Last year, everybody was just desperate for the takeover to come through. At that time, hoping that it was going to be the right owners moving forward. And, it was just nice to, maybe slightly exaggerate, but have a football club to keep on following, supporting, and to see everything and, people keeping jobs and a whole plethora of things. Whereas this year, it was very much a relief to maybe forget about the season completely. There was a big contrast between the Chelsea supporters and the Newcastle fans who were having a big party on the day. I think obviously their Champions League qualifications they've had a smoother start to life under new owners, let's say. And yeah, I think for Chelsea, it was a performance that, didn't have too much to hate about it. They were able to come back from behind, which hasn't always been the case this season. And I think I was slightly surprised by just how many Chelsea fans did stay behind to show their appreciation. But more than anything, I guess it showed the uncertainty that's still to come moving forward. Obviously, you mentioned Loftus-Cheek and Azpilicueta there. Azpilicueta is one of those whose future is a bit uncertain. Perhaps it looked a bit more of a goodbye than we expected after that game. But Lampard said in the press conference they don't know what is happening with his future. But I think the big talking point going into the match, certainly on social media, was Mason Mount. Was he going to be involved? Had he already played his last game? And I think as he kind of moved across the pitch, there was certainly something in him that made it look like there's the possibility it could have been. There was no final farewell. There wasn't any big waves like Loftus-Cheek, but it looked a poignant moment for him. I think just before he went in the tunnel, we were, as everybody was, looking on from the press box, searching for tears and all those kind of things. But he did seem to put his hands through his head. I don't know whether there was maybe some frustration there about how things had panned out so far, and maybe it wasn't how he expected things to be. And I think that's where a lot of Chelsea lie at the minute. You could, rattle off a lot of players who we don't know the futures. There's Kovacic, there's obviously João Felix is now resolved, but perhaps we didn't know what was going to happen there at the weekend. And, at that point, Pochettino still hadn't been announced. We knew it was Lampard's last game. It was just, I guess, a moment where, much like we were last season, a new era is set to begin, but we just don't know what that's going to be yet.
I think in a more drastic way, I remember the conversations as well, writing about it on Football.London at the time. Last summer felt like a rebuild was needed, and now a rebuild is needed again, which kind of shows you how bad this season has been and how chaotic Chelsea have been in recent years of kind of needing this massive reset, and probably much more so than the new ownership would have wanted to do. I think they would have wanted to look at last summer as that, but it seems like it's going to have to be this summer. You speak about Mason Mount there. I mean, this was a guy who was lifting a second consecutive player of the season as voted for by supporters last year. Thiago Silva was very close last year as well, and he's got it this time, quite obvious. You know, he is someone that I think it's just staggering given how important he was in a Champions League win, how big of a player he felt for the future of Chelsea, kind of a face of Chelsea. And to think that he could be leaving on kind of this downbeat note is one of many things that supporters are frustrated about with the new ownership and the way they've mishandled certain situations.
Yeah, definitely. I think looking back at especially that Champions League run and that Premier League season, it felt when Chelsea weren't good, Mason Mount was still very good. And you know, this season, things haven't worked out for Mount on the pitch. He didn't produce the form I guess we've come to expect. I think we had some goals against Aston Villa, and we hope that was a launch pad. It didn't quite work out. He then went to the World Cup, and there's been injuries. And I think even not including this whole contract situation, things have not turned out how he would have expected this season. We're now, hearing things about how that contract situation's been handled. That was meant to be one of the early priorities of the new ownership, alongside tying Reece James down, and it's not worked out in quite the same way for Mount. There's obviously a lot out there about how he perhaps wanted a better salary, having been undervalued in his previous contract. But, we've now had hints that he perhaps was offered something before the World Cup, and then that's went back, and they've had to start again a little bit. And I think there's just a great deal of frustration there. I think you pitched a title for the podcast earlier this season that was Chaos and Trophies, and it's felt this season's been mainly chaos, and I think the Mount situation has felt a little bit like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bobby Vincent, I know, wrote a piece on Football.London about the Mount situation and kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff. Definitely people should go and read for more context, and just kind of reflects how up and down these contract negotiations are. I think there are a lot of parallels to the Andreas Christensen and Antonio Rudiger situation last year. Of course, both of those ended up leaving. Could the same happen with Mount? We do now want to go back to last summer. Of course, the takeover happened, almost a year ago. I believe we were on a Facebook Live discussing the announcement early June, the first week of June 2022. And then we headed into the summer, the takeover. We had the signings of Raheem Sterling in front of the palm trees in LA. We had the start of pre-season. Kalidou Koulibaly signed in Las Vegas. Things felt a lot more positive and hopeful, but I guess the signs of discontent under Thomas Tuchel and the new ownership were already starting to show, weren't they, in the US tour?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that period, even more so than the relationship between Tuchel and the owners, there was obviously discontent with how it was planned, the facilities, the travelling, the length of it. There's been a lot of said about the preparation from that. And I think now both Graham Potter and Frank Lampard have noted that as, one of a litany of reasons why things perhaps haven't worked out as expected. But yeah, there was obviously a degree of expectation from Tuchel to be more involved, more collaborative within the transfer approach. There was the suggestion that he would prefer to coach the team and get the best out of the team, I guess, as we saw ahead of that moment. And I think from there, it just, things turned difficult. You noted a couple of signs there. I think from the outside, we saw a lot of good signings. I don't think many people would complain at the addition of Raheem Sterling, but that sort of relationship between club and head coach, I guess you start to see the confusion highlighted when Raheem Sterling is kind of given the keys to Chelsea's attack, promised that leading role, and then a difficult start to the Premier League season. All of a sudden we turn around, and after being mentioned very early in the window that a striker was maybe needed, but Tuchel was maybe happy with what he had, we had the turnaround and Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang signed on deadline day. And that was very obviously, I guess, a compromise of sorts because of that connection with Tuchel. Aubameyang, obviously, a very, very big history in terms of scoring goals. And sorry to, I guess, skip ahead a little bit, but it's hard to then fathom in many ways that barely a week later Tuchel has lost his job. And while you can maybe understand the reasons that maybe the new owners wanted somebody who would fit in with their system, they wanted that collaborative approach where they could discuss everything. It becomes hard to justify signing somebody like Aubameyang when you then. It obviously must have been on the mind that Tuchel wasn't their man, and yeah, I guess that kind of typified the whole summer, and was the sign that this speeded up transition period that was hoped for. Obviously, they started off on the back foot by not having Christensen and Rudiger and players like that, and I think you give a degree of sympathy there. But it started to become, as we kind of noted earlier, a bit more chaotic with Boehly leading things in the transfer window without the help of the likes of Petr Cech, who I don't believe wanted to stay on, or Marina Granovskaya, who I think when she left, it was said that she would aid in the transition, but it did feel that this was, the TODD BOEHLY and TODD BOEHLY show in terms of driving through the next set of transfers.
I do think the downfall of Tuchel is not all on the ownership. I think there have maybe been a bit of revisionism since because of how bad the rest of the season looks from a Chelsea point of view, that things weren't that great of Tuchel on performance basis if we look back to the start of 2022 when, of course, the previous ownership was still in charge. I want to talk about one specific game, and I know to many people it won't feel that significant because it was a pre-season game, but to me, seeing it live in person in Orlando, it did mirror what was about to come for both clubs actually on that night, and that was Arsenal smashing Chelsea 4-0, and it was quite a concerning performance from a Chelsea point of view because of the fitness, as we've already touched on, in terms of the lack of cohesion between players. Certain players like Michy Batshuayi still having a part, Timo Werner, Marcos Alonso, these would all be players that would be gone in a matter of weeks at Chelsea and sold. That to me, and that also was the night that preceded that post-match interview from Tuchel where he said, if you have the same players, you've got the same problems effectively. That to me was such a key night and just reflected and kind of, as I say, foreshadowed what was to come, because that collapse that night was very reminiscent of what we've seen basically for the rest of this season, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think when you think about how, I guess, frustrating and the chaos that has been recently, to know that it was present, weeks into pre-season is a scary thought in itself. You shouldn't be that frustrated. It should all be positive at that time. And I think, that squad that went out on the US tour, I think would have been a frustration for everyone. Seeing, I guess, players that you noted there, but likes of Ross Barkley and Marcos Alonso, who, went at the end of the window for nothing. It was certainly a sign that things weren't right. The, transition of the squad wasn't occurring smoothly. And I guess that becomes the worry this season with the bloated squad that they have remaining now. But yeah, that game was a bit of a body blow. Thomas Tuchel's frustrations came to the fore very evidently, I think, and that was the sign, because it wasn't far away from the Premier League season starting either. It was obviously quite a shortened pre-season in terms of how late last year finished, and obviously the early start of the Premier League season with the World Cup forthcoming. And, I think the only positive maybe from that game was that Koulibaly's first kind of performance. He came on as a substitute, and he actually looked pretty good that night, despite the scoreline, I think. But yeah, it's when you look at that squad, and I think players have to, go down and then move to play with the development squad for opportunities. I think obviously Broja and Colin maybe got injured as well, but Gilmore and players like that. But there were still so many people who would go on to leave, who needed to leave. How much of the preparation was true preparation for the Premier League season. And, as it turns out, the team weren't prepared for the season. You look at those early games, I think Everton, Chelsea obviously got that win, but Raheem Sterling was perhaps the only player to come out with much merit in that
Yeah.
occasion. The game against Leeds was a really, harrowing result. And look where Leeds ended up at the end of the season as well, I guess. But
Southampton too, lost to Southampton, another
yeah,
relegated team.
Mentioning that Southampton game, it was a really telling point where, again, Tuchel kind of was quite open in the press conference. He was very frustrated with the inability of his team to, I guess, do the basics in defence, really compete. And that became a little bit of a tenet in recent weeks of Frank Lampard. Obviously, a lot has been said about the fitness, and maybe a lot of that has been pushed on to Graham Potter's time at the club, why they weren't up there. But that ability to compete and sustain, I think Lampard would say, the capacity to really feel contact with the opposition players was there early on. And, perhaps that is a mental aspect inside the squad that needed to be resolved as well. But I think, as you noted, that Tuchel's time looks better because of where Chelsea ended up. Sorry, this season. Obviously, Tuchel did have a degree of success with Chelsea before this season, but there was a toxicity that was emerging even back then. Certainly after that Southampton game, and maybe nobody expected Tuchel to lose his job immediately after that game in Croatia, but he looked lost for answers that night as well. Obviously, another awful defeat. I think he was just so frustrated with the team that he almost didn't know what to say to them anymore. He didn't understand why they were playing like they were. And, when you don't understand that, that is a really dangerous position as well.
Yeah, I do think it is convenient to look at that situation now and say, Chelsea was stupid to sack Tuchel. They may have been stupid to sack Tuchel, but it also is kind of not looking at the full picture to say everything was rosy, and it was, I don't think it was as shocking as, say, the Jose Mourinho sacking in 2007, for instance, that people referred to. We were talking about a team that looked lost for ideas in the opening weeks of the season, and even the wins against the likes of Everton, against the likes of Leicester, West Ham, were either coming from a goal down or were just very unconvincing performances. So it just set things in a negative sort of motion as the season begun. Obviously, we don't have all the time in the world to kind of break down everything from Graham Potter. I think that the core I want to get to of Graham Potter is him coming into an environment where it felt like, because there was so much apathy about how the season had begun, upset with Tuchel being sacked, a coach who was very popular amongst supporters. Was he set up to fail from the beginning, in the sense that he was fighting a losing battle that, say, Tuchel didn't have to contend with when he arrived at Chelsea, because there were no fans inside stadiums to show that apathy or frustration?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because you think back to Potter's start, and it's easily forgotten that they went on. Did he match the record for unbeaten run as a Chelsea manager? I think to start.
I believe
the game.
it was
like
9 games, if I remember rightly.
Yeah,
I think it was 9.
And perhaps there wasn't the joyous abundance of enthusiasm, because they weren't racking up wins at that point. I think he started against Salzburg, obviously, and they got the win against Crystal Palace, and he tried some, I guess, obscure things with Raheem Sterling at wing back and those kind of things. But that's, it's hard to look past the Brighton game where they got beat. Obviously, a bit of a crazy atmosphere from Brighton, really getting on the back of Potter. But the manner of that defeat felt very easy. That was perhaps reminiscent of some of those early performances, and things never really recovered from there. And that idea of not being Thomas Tuchel, I think, was really difficult for Potter to kind of lift off himself. He wasn't the same character in press conferences. He wouldn't produce the easy soundbite for everybody to get behind. So that process of, really warming to a manager, I think, was going to take a long time. And then when the results fell away and faltered, and, Chelsea really started to struggle, he didn't really have any credit in the bank. I think at one point it felt like those AC Milan wins could really be the start of something. They felt really accomplished, and I guess Potter's record in Europe was actually pretty good. And that would have been the area where people maybe had the biggest questions, because it's not something he'd done with a top side before. But Chelsea had all those injuries at that time as well, so we were seeing you know, I almost lose count of how many right wing backs we saw. Pulisic, Loftus-Cheek, I think Gallagher played there against Newcastle in November. Nothing really just settled nicely. He never really got that opportunity to, you know, look like he was in control. I think he was always chasing a win, chasing the system, and then before you know it, Chelsea are signing hundreds of millions of pounds worth of players in January, and he has a whole new group to win over. And I think there is that sense of people asking the question: did Potter ever really win over Chelsea's group? Perhaps not when you look at the Sterling quotes that came out following the weekend, and it's just, it is difficult. I think what maybe is a bit more interesting to look upon is you asked the question: do you think Potter would have done or been produced more some convincing performances than what Frank Lampard did at the end of the season? I think the answer is possibly he would have. Not to say he necessarily should have kept the job, because much like Tuchel's game in Croatia, the game against Aston Villa, the stadium really did turn in a big way. Certainly maybe directed towards the owners at that point, even rather than the team. But yeah, he just couldn't find momentum. And even when things were positive, the momentum never lasted long enough.
I remember when Potter was appointed, you know, maybe people internally at Chelsea, but also externally, were sort of saying this is kind of a big experiment, you know, taking someone from one level of expectation to a radically different one. And is that one of the key things that the owners have learnt this season, particularly with the Pochettino appointment, is as maybe holistic or kind of nice the idea of taking someone from one level who did very good work. I think it's easily forgotten now because of how well De Zerbi has done there, how good Potter's work was at Brighton for a few years. But actually, when you're at this big club, when you're at a stage of transition, which Chelsea have been for a lot of years now, you need a bigger force of character. What you actually say in public matters, and he just did not have that force of character to win over supporters or even the players. And that maybe is a sad indictment of the culture around like elite football, but that's just the harsh reality.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, you know, this kind of season has perhaps shown that Chelsea squad has not had the resilience that many would hope for. They've needed a character to galvanise them, perhaps. And I guess that was the idea about bringing Lampard in, to inspire something of the old Chelsea and the standards that have been there. And, you know, sorry to touch on Lampard when we're talking about Potter, but he has mentioned it's a quiet dressing room. Obviously, dressing rooms aren't set in stone. They haven't got to be slanging matches after every defeat, but you need people in a squad to really take control. And, you know, the leadership thing has been an issue for Chelsea and something that has been talked about coming into this season. Obviously, Kante, Jorginho, Thiago Silva heading out of contract. Azpilicueta was expected to leave for a long time. They are the senior members of the squad. There are a lot of members of the squad who have the armband. Kovacic, another one who could leave this summer, who was expected to have the armband. And there were a lot of conversations, certainly between us and our colleagues, about who are going to take Chelsea into the next era, who's going to be that John Terry figure. Maybe that doesn't exist in the same way, but Mason Mount, I guess, was one pitched as a leader, Reece James, but they're not necessarily the loud vocal figures you have, maybe a lead by example kind of guys. And that has been something that has been missing. I think it's probably why the likes of Declan Rice has been on that transfer shortlist for such a long time, that they need to find those characters. And, you know, when we're looking back at the season, perhaps that vacuum of leadership has played a role. People, you know, ensuring that everybody is meeting the standards at all times in training. And, you know, I guess with that group becoming so big under Potter, you know, from a coaching perspective, that becomes difficult. You have two matches rather than just one. You have to, you know, hope that everybody is pulling their weight in each individual thing, which they should be as professionals. But when players like Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang clearly haven't got a future at Chelsea from, you know, Christmas time, they'll never be there any longer, not included in Champions League squads, it's going to be hard to motivate yourself to the same extent. And does that feed into other players? Hakim Ziyech, obviously expected to leave on transfer deadline day. He was straight back into the team, and I guess to some extent maybe that was an attempt from Potter to try and ensure that his motivation was still there. He could still feel involved at Chelsea. But when you have this issue of a transition, a lot of players, certainly now that they added so many in January that have to leave, how do you get buy-in from everybody? How do you kind of inspire the standards? And then I guess that has probably been a difficulty for Potter, certainly for Lampard towards the end of the season. And I think, as you said, maybe Chelsea have learned a little bit when you mentioned about kind of experimenting. Pochettino obviously has worked with this level of club before. He's also managed the likes of Southampton and drove those up the league, which is the position Chelsea are in at the moment. But also when you look at the contract Pochettino's been offered, 2 years with the club having the option for a third. They're not committing in the same way. Obviously Potter, everything was geared towards, you are going to be our long-term guy. We don't have expectation of Champions League football, despite at that stage of the season Chelsea being in a position where they could contend for it. Maybe things have relaxed a little. The hierarchy across the club is now in place. It obviously wasn't at the start of the season. And despite this, season maybe even feeling more of a rebuild year than what last summer did, maybe they're in a better position to try and launch that rebuild now.
I think we want to end by focusing on the ownership, and because we can talk about the managers and the coaches and the players and the staff involved. Obviously, they play a massive part in the success or failure of Chelsea, but from top down, it has felt like a chaotic period for the club, and there's no point getting around it. I mean, particularly TODD BOEHLY's name, if you search him in Google right now, if you listen to some of the podcasts around him, if you read some of the articles around him and the ownership, it's not good. The perception is one of someone who has come into football and, to put it frankly, and it sounds disrespectful, but doesn't know what they're doing. And that is the perception of a lot of supporters I speak to who are concerned about what the next few years are going to hold after this one. And we go back to the summer where he was interim sporting director. This was someone who had never worked in professional football before. As we've just discussed, it took a long time for those sporting directors to be appointed. Around October, November time is when the first few names, I think Vival and Lawrence Stewart, came out. And then, of course, the sacking of Graham Potter after committing so much to him felt like a step back or an admission of failure. And of course, the massive January spend. What do you think is the biggest mistake or kind of lesson that this ownership group, and I don't just want, we use the name of BOEHLY because he at times he has put himself front and centre, but I guess it's bigger than that. It's Clearlake Capital. Is there one thing you kind of pin down and say, yeah, they've got this drastically wrong and they need to learn with a bit of humility this summer to get it right?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to see how this can be put in place swiftly, but I think if you look at Chelsea in its entirety, obviously the men's senior team have had a woeful time, but if you look at the women's side, they've continued their success under Emma Hayes. The development squad, they actually had quite a lot of investment also from the ownership early on, added some new players, new coach in Mark Robinson, but with the consistency of Jim Fraser and Neil Bath, they had a much better season, rebound from nearly being relegated the year before to challenging for a title. And if you look in those two areas, and that stability, I think has obviously been the launch pad for how they've been able to, improve and develop. And they obviously the women's side signed a lot of players early on in the new ownership's kind of tenure, but they were all done very early in the transfer window. And, it seemed organised, it seemed stable. And if you compare that to the men's side, there's been no stability in coaching and playing staff, in the sporting structure above it, which obviously stretches across more of the club. But everything is obviously tied to the men's team in terms of public perception. So when you're looking at new sponsors, there's nothing happened on that front yet either. It's felt very chaotic, and things need to settle down. I think the chaos was added to when BOEHLY became sporting director, in the sense everything played out very publicly as well. There were a few deals that didn't get leaked in some regard, and Chelsea missed out on a lot as well. If you look at the likes of Jules Koundé and those meetings in Barcelona, Rafinha, of course, as well. It was a brash summer. I think we saw and heard a lot, and while from the outside a lot of the signings that were made did look good in the end. Perhaps they came too late. Perhaps they weren't the right people at the right time. And I think when we get to that point where Bowley and Barley can take a real step back, perhaps become involved when they really need to drive a deal over the line, such as when they made that decision to go for Enzo Fernandez in January, maybe that will be better. But I think the key point is you need to put the club in the position to be stable. So this transition does need to happen. You need to get rid of the players. You need to set up the deals that can last for, the next, 4 or 5 years, however long these commercial deals last. And once there's sporting structures in place, you need to trust them. Things might not work out all the time, but the club needs to grow and develop under this new identity. And while it has had success in chaos and the turnover of managers, I think that was probably a unique situation under Roman Abramovich. Few teams can operate like that and continue success. And, realistically, Chelsea had got further away from being a Premier League title contender, and finding a stable base to grow from, I think, is going to be the key thing to, trying to catch those teams again.
Yeah, it feels like across the club, as I think you're right to mention, and we'll probably focus on this in the podcast, particularly the women's side, they have been unaffected this season. I know it's been a challenging year in the sense of Emma Hayes not being able to field a consistent starting 11, but they've won a 4th consecutive WSL title. They have won another FA Cup. They have competed more seriously in the Champions League, made developments, even though they did get knocked out to Barcelona. It felt like on that side, and they've already set up signings, even though they're losing Pernille Harder and Magda Eriksson, 2 key figures within that team. You don't feel, as with the evidence of recent years, that is going to completely destabilise the whole squad, because you've got a consistent power at the top of that in Emma Hayes, and there's a real strategy. And I think that is something, competence, and kind of, that is something that has just been so lacking from Chelsea. It feels like in so many areas. Just one final thing, and maybe this is unrealistic, but it's something that I've spoken about with supporters who have been frustrated, and I personally have been as well, and just a little bit miffed, to be honest, is communication. Because we've seen TODD BOEHLY as early as, say, September. I remember that we completely rushed over the All-Star suggestion, which caused a lot of controversy back then, and got his name and got a lot of criticism in the media at the time. We've seen him speak at other private events. There was another conference he spoke about recently. And I know as the season has gone on, supporters on social media I've spoken to have been frustrated with the fact that it seems like the new ownership, particularly BOEHLY, will speak to media. They'll speak at private events about Chelsea. They'll even speak to Gary Cottrell when he's chasing him down with a microphone near a car. But there hasn't been an official communication from the ownership to the supporters through, say, the club website or the Twitter, wherever it is. Do you think that is something that should be a requirement, or it is maybe a misstep again that has lost faith and trust from supporters, and it feels like they're being talked over rather than directly to in this difficult time?
Yeah, I think it's probably a missed opportunity as well, because certainly when they were setting their stall out, I think there was a lot of positive things to get behind. Obviously, they have done things like set up the fans forum and try to engage on that level on an enhanced basis. But as you said, they have kept their distance, and it's not just BOEHLY who spoke at these conferences. It is Barley, and it is Jose Feliciano, who's obviously another clear capital guy, and they have talked about the Premier League and Chelsea and what they hope to get out of it at business conferences. Like you say, it feels very industry focused, and I know certainly from speaking to a former colleague, Adam Newson, early in the season, his knowledge of them at that time, he felt it'd be really good for them to speak publicly, that they came across really well, and that was the perception of them. And, I think Chelsea haven't had almost a face to not vent to, but to connect with. That has always been on the manager, the press conferences, and they get asked questions that they don't really have the capability to answer. Certainly Lampard at the end of the season in his caretaker role, it really limits what you can, find out about the direction of the club. And I think what is particularly frustrating for me is when, you see every signing, you see every big decision, obviously Pochettino and the new CEO on Tuesday as well. you'll have comments from Bowley, and then you'll have separate comments from Egbardi and Feliciano, and from the players as well. You hear all these lovely things about the project, how excited everybody is, but there's not really been that pitch to supporters yet. It's been reliant on them finding these snippets. And I think, like you say, a sit-down interview, maybe they're worried about it being a bigger misstep in itself. They've seen the criticism they've got, and maybe they worry about how that can be taken, held against them, or stripped down and posted on Twitter to make them look silly. But I think it would go a long way. These guys are supposedly here for the long term. There should be a relationship to an extent between owners and supporters, even if it's an end of season little interview to say, sorry, this hasn't worked out, or we believe this has worked out. We're sorry about the results, but we see this is how things are going to go forward. And maybe it gives supporters something to buy into. Chelsea obviously previously had an owner who was distant, didn't need to engage on that front. I guess he spoke with his checkbook in many respects and the trophies early on. But at the same time, that becomes an area where these owners can quickly be an improvement. It can be an easy win. And, when they have the likes of Daniel Finkelstein and coming on the board, obviously as supporters, that is a positive thing. But you want the owner as much to be a savvy businessman who can guide your team in the right direction. You want them to be a supporter to an extent as well. You want to feel like they maybe are not one of the fans singing in the stands, having a drink, but you want to feel like they are one of you, even, from the US and, have a baseball team or what have you. That I think there is an opportunity there that they can take. Maybe it's more difficult a year on, given how the seasons went. But I think people would, at least a core of people would be receptive to it, even if a lot of people would try to, push Bowley down.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that fear. You do wonder after how badly things have gone this season, and given how open they have been in other forums, I think to some it feels a little bit inconsistent, and I can understand that critique. But there we go. We happily and in a relief sense are able to close the book on the 2022-23 season from a Chelsea point of view. Just before we wrap up, Scott, what have we got coming up on Football.London for Chelsea fans to read as we head into what is going to be still a very busy period, particularly as we head towards June the 30th?
Yeah, I guess unsurprisingly, transfer season will be starting. We'll be sowing the seeds to see what Pochettino has to do, what his requirements perhaps are. There are obviously certain positions that the club have acknowledged for a while. They need to strengthen in goal, midfield, up front. So there'll be lots on that in the next few weeks. Obviously, I guess the next big point to watch out for, certainly in relation to N'Golo Kante's contract, is the retained and released lists. That should come in the next week or so. And yeah, it's certainly a very interesting time for Chelsea. And who knows what things could look like in just 2 weeks' time when that transfer window begins to open.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we will be covering it not only on View from the Bridge, but also on Football.London, where you can see all the latest Chelsea news. Please do go and check it out. Thank you for listening, and I'm sure we will see you again very soon, because as we know of Chelsea, it's always chaos, and hopefully some more trophies next season. All the best.